She's a dead weight, just an expense and a worry. The words were from my own son, sent by mistake, a casual sentence that shattered my entire world. The phone in my hand felt cold, heavier than it was a moment before, and the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock, each second a hammer blow against the silence. What I did after hearing that message, sitting alone in my quiet house, changed everything for them and for me. So stay with me until the end. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your phone, your work, or the comfort of your couch at home. My name is Eleanor Vance, and at 78 years old, I've learned that the quietest moments are often the loudest. For nearly a decade since my husband passed, my life here in Asheville has been a collection of small, predictable rituals. I was a seamstress my whole life, my hands once nimble and sure, creating beauty from bolts of fabric. Now, those same hands, dotted with the maps of age and stiff with a touch of arthritis, spend their time tending to the geraniums that bloom with defiant color in my window boxes, a splash of life against the weathered wood of my small bungalow. The mornings always started the same way. The rich, earthy smell of brewing coffee would fill my small kitchen, a comforting aroma that cut through the cool mountain air drifting in from the porch. I'd turn on the radio, always to the classic hit station, letting the familiar melodies of the 60s and 70s become the soundtrack to my solitude. Those songs were ghosts of a fuller house, of a life lived with my dear Arthur. Now they were just pleasant company as I watched the mist curl around the distant Blue Ridge peaks, a daily spectacle of quiet grandeur that never failed to soothe my soul. Loneliness is a constant companion in a house this quiet, but it's a gentle one, not a cruel one. Or so I thought. The real sun in my week, the day that chased all the shadows away, was Sunday. That's when my son, Richard, and his wife, Susan, would bring my grandson, Leo, for dinner. The house would transform, filled with the sound of Leo's 8-year-old chatter about school and dinosaurs, the scent of the lasagna I'd lovingly prepare, Richard's favorite since he was a boy, and the polite, if distant, presence of Susan. That rainy Tuesday began like any other. The sky a blanket of soft gray, and the sound of drizzle a gentle tapping on the roof. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when my old smartphone chimed. Richard had insisted I get it for emergencies, though I found the thing more of a nuisance than a comfort. Seeing his name on the screen, however, brought a familiar warmth to my chest. I smiled, thinking it was a sweet check-in, maybe a reminder about what Leo wanted for dessert next Sunday. I dried my hands, tapped the screen, and pressed play on the audio message. But the voice that filled my kitchen wasn't meant for me. It was Richard, speaking to Susan, his tone heavy with a weariness that felt like a physical blow. "Susan, I can't do this anymore," he sighed, the sound tinny and horribly clear. "We're going to have to put my mom in a home. She's becoming a dead weight." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hand flying to my mouth as if to stifle a cry that wasn't there. He wasn't finished. His voice continued, each syllable a fresh wound, carving into the foundation of my world, that house, the time we waste every Sunday. She's no use for anything anymore, just an expense and a worry. A worry, an expense, a dead weight. The phone slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden crushing silence. The message had ended, but his voice echoed in my head, a venomous loop of betrayal. The son I had rocked in my arms, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the man whose favorite meal I still cooked with love, saw me as an object, a piece of furniture to be discarded. The ticking of the old wall clock above the stove, a sound I usually found comforting, became torturous. Tick, dead weight, talk, an expense, tick, no use for anything, talk, a home. The rain outside seemed to intensify, beating against the windows as if trying to get in, to join the storm that had just broken inside my chest. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the phone on the floor, a little black rectangle that had just detonated my life. My breath was shallow, caught somewhere in my throat, which had become painfully dry. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, I bent down to pick up the device. My own reflection stared back at me from the dark screen. a pale, shocked old woman with fear in her eyes. I didn't recognize her. The Eleanor I knew was the pillar of her family, the keeper of memories, the quiet center of their lives. This woman was just a burden. The word felt foul in my mind. A burden. Was that all I had become? The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the endless sewing to pay for his college books. Had it all been erased, replaced by this cold, cruel accounting? My gaze drifted to the framed photos on the mantelpiece. There was Richard on his graduation day, his arm around me, both of us beaming. There was a family portrait from last Christmas, Leo squished between us, Susan smiling a tight, polite smile. It all felt like a lie now, a carefully constructed play where I was the only one who didn't know my role was ending. Susan's impatience, her brief answers, the way she always checked her watch during Sunday dinner. I had always excused it as the stress of a modern working mother. Now I saw it for what it was. Resentment. I sank into my favorite armchair, the fabric worn smooth over the years by my husband's frame and then my own. The house, my sanctuary, suddenly felt alien. Every object seemed to mock me. The hand-stitched quilt on mine, the sofa, the curtains I had sewn myself, the faint scent of cinnamon from Sunday's apple pie. They were all artifacts of a life I thought I had, a love I thought was returned, but it was a transaction. And apparently the terms were no longer favorable for my son, my only son. The thought of Leo brought a fresh wave of pain, his little hand in mine as we walked in the garden, the colorful, chaotic drawings he would bring me, always taped proudly to my refrigerator. "This is you and me, Grandma," he'd say, pointing to two smiling stick figures. What did he know of this? Was he listening as his parents discussed discarding his grandmother? The innocence of his love was the only pure thing left, and the thought that it, too, might be tainted by their cold practicality was unbearable. A cold dread seeped into my bones, more chilling than the damp air. A home. The phrase conjured images of sterile hallways, the smell of disinfectant, and rows of elderly people staring blankly at television. Screens. Waiting for a visit that might not come. Waiting for the end. Was that to be my final chapter? Shipped off to a place where I would be out of sight, out of mind. My beloved bungalow sold to fund someone else's life. My geraniums left to wither in their boxes. I replayed the message again in my mind, searching for any ambiguity, any room for misunderstanding. There was none. Richard's voice was not angry. It was worse. It was exhausted, resigned, the sound of a man who had made a decision and was simply stating a logistical fact. He wasn't debating it. He was announcing it. The casual cruelty of it was what broke me. It wasn't a heated argument. It was a business decision. I was a line item on his budget that needed to be cut. My hands, resting on my lap, clenched into fists. The knuckles were white, the skin stretched thin over the bone. These hands had soothed his fevers, applauded his successes, and held him when his own heart was broken. For decades, they had only known how to give, to create, to soothe. Now, for the first time, they felt the urge to fight back. But how? What could a 78-year-old widow do against the determined plans of her own child? I had no power, no leverage, or so it seemed. The rain continued to fall, washing over the town of Asheville in a relentless sheet of gray. It mirrored the despair that was washing over me. I felt a profound sense of failure. Had I loved him too much? Had I made myself so available, so constant, that I had become invisible? Like a sturdy old chair, you only notice it when you decide it's time to throw it out for something new. The comparison was bitter, but it felt true. I was the old furniture in his sleek, modern life. I thought about confronting him. Imagined calling him, my voice trembling, and asking, "Richard, what did I hear?" The shame of it was a physical weight. To let him know I had heard his deepest, most uncensored thoughts about me felt like stripping myself naked in a town square. The humiliation would be absolute. He would likely deny it. Or worse, try to justify it with soft, patronizing words about how it was for my own good. Alternatively, I could say nothing. I could pretend the message never arrived. I could welcome them on Sunday with my lasagna and a smile, all while this poison corroded me from the inside. I could watch their faces, searching for signs, knowing that behind their polite inquiries about my week, they were planning my removal. The thought was suffocating. It would be a living death, waiting for the axe to fall, knowing it was being swung by the hand I once taught to hold a spoon. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, finally cut through the cold fog of my shock. How dare he? How dare he reduce my life, my love, to a matter of convenience? The woman who went without a new coat so he could have the best winter boots. The woman who stayed up all night sewing costumes for his school play so he wouldn't feel left out. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an erasure of my entire history, of everything I had ever been to him. The feeling didn't last. It was quickly drowned by a tide of helplessness. What were my options, really? My savings were modest, enough for emergencies, but not enough to live on independently for years if my health failed. My Social Security check covered the bills and groceries, but little else. I was, in a practical sense, dependent on the unspoken promise that my son would care for me, just as I had cared for him. That promise had just been declared null and void. I looked out the window, past the rain-streaked glass. The world outside seemed distant, muffled. My neighbors were living their lives, making dinner, watching television, completely unaware that in this small bungalow, a woman's universe had just collapsed. The isolation felt absolute. I had friends from church, but this was a private family shame, not something I could confess over coffee and cake. It was a wound too deep and too personal to expose. For hours, I just sat there in the armchair as the afternoon light faded and the room filled with shadows. I didn't turn on a lamp. The darkness felt appropriate, a fitting cloak for my thoughts. The ticking clock continued its merciless rhythm. The house was no longer a comfort. It was a cage, a beautiful, well-kept cage, from which I was about to be evicted by my own zookeeper. My entire life had been defined by my role as a wife and a mother. With Arthur gone and Richard seeing me as a liability, who was I? Eleanor Vance, the seamstress, was a ghost. Eleanor Vance, the wife, was a memory. And Eleanor Vance, the mother, had just been fired from the only job she ever truly loved. The sense of being unmoored, of having my identity stripped away, was terrifying. I was nothing more than an old woman in a quiet house, waiting. The fight I had felt earlier flickered and died. What was the point? I was tired. A deep, soul-level weariness settled over me. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe I was just a dead weight. The doubts began to creep in, whispering that I was overreacting, that this is just what happens. People get old. They become a burden. It's the natural order of things. But another voice, a fainter one, whispered back that it didn't have to be this way. Dignity was not something that could be taken from you unless you gave it away. I closed my eyes, and the faces of my family swam in the darkness behind my lids. Richard's tired face from the audio message, Susan's polite, impatient smile, and Leo's bright, shining eyes, full of unquestioning love. It was his face that held me. What would he be told? That Grandma had to go away? That she was too much trouble? The idea of my son poisoning my grandson's memory of me was the final, unbearable straw. As night fell completely, the rain finally softened to a gentle patter. The storm outside was ending, but the one inside me was just beginning. I felt utterly cornered, trapped between the humiliation of confrontation and the silent agony of complicity. There was no easy path, no right answer. Every option felt like a different kind of defeat. I sat there in the dark, a prisoner in my own home, with my son's voice echoing in the silence, and I had absolutely no idea what to do next. The darkness in the living room became a heavy blanket, suffocating me with my own memories. For a long time, I did nothing but breathe. In, out, a shallow mechanical rhythm that proved I was still alive, even though I felt like a ghost in my own home. The rain had stopped, and the silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the steady, judgmental ticking of the clock. Each tick was another second of my life wasted, another moment closer to being packed up and put away, like a piece of old china that no longer matched the set. I felt a coldness creep up from the floorboards, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the ice forming around my heart. My body ached with a weariness that went beyond my 78 years. It was the exhaustion of a lifetime of love being thrown back in my face. I thought of Richard as a little boy, his face buried in my apron, crying over a scraped knee. I was his comfort, his safe harbor. Now, he was the storm, and I was the ship he was ready to scuttle. The cruelty of it was bottomless. It wasn't just about the words, it was about the casualness, the finality. He had already mourned my usefulness and was simply arranging the funeral. I pushed myself out of the armchair, my joints protesting with a series of creaks and groans. My feet felt like lead as I walked through the familiar shadows of my home. My hand trailed along the wall, brushing against the framed photos I could no longer bear to look at. In the hallway, I stopped in front of the cedar chest that sat against the wall. It had been my mother's, and inside was my life's work. Not the life of a mother, but the life of Eleanor Vance, the seamstress. My fingers trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar wood and old fabric filled the air, a perfume of my past. Inside, spools of thread were arranged like a rainbow of soldiers, and neat stacks of fabric remnants told stories of wedding dresses, baptismal gowns, and prom night alterations. On the very top lay my old sewing kit, a worn leather case holding the tools of my trade. Thimbles, needles, a pair of heavy silver shears that still felt perfectly balanced in my hand. These were not the tools of a dead weight. They were instruments of creation, of repair, of making something beautiful and strong out of simple cloth. They were an extension of the woman I used to be. My fingers brushed against a small velvet pouch tucked in a corner of the chest. I knew what was inside before I even opened it. I pulled the drawstring and tipped the contents into my palm. It was a collection of old buttons, each one saved from a special garment. A pearlescent button from the dress I wore on my first date with Arthur, a tiny brass button from Richard's first baby coat, a crystal button from the wedding gown I sewed for a neighbor's daughter, a girl who couldn't afford a store-bought dress. Each button was a memory, a testament to a life of purpose. As I held that tiny brass button from Richard's coat, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, seismic realignment of my soul. This button represented a promise I had made to a helpless infant, to protect him, to provide for him, to love him unconditionally. I had kept my promise. He, however, had forgotten the promises a child makes back, the unspoken ones of gratitude, respect, and care. He saw me as a liability from his present, but he was forgetting the asset I had been to his entire past. The shock began to recede, and in its place, a slow burning anger started to smolder. It was an unfamiliar feeling. I was not a woman prone to anger. My life had been acceptance one of quiet and gentle perseverance. But this was different. This wasn't anger at a stranger or at fate. It was a deep, primal rage at the injustice of being erased by the very person I had created. He had judged my worth and found it lacking. Now I would have to find a way to show him the error in his calculations. But what could I possibly do? The question hung in the air, mocking me. I was an old woman. My savings were meager, my body was frail, and my only son was plotting to put me in a home. The helplessness I'd felt earlier returned, trying to snuff out the new flame of my anger. It whispered insidious doubts in my ear. He's right. You are a burden. This is what happens. You are powerless. I closed my eyes, the cold metal of a button pressing into my palm, a small point of pain to anchor me. I thought about Susan, her cool demeanor and her perfectly manicured nails that never touched the dishwater in my sink. She saw my home not as a place of warmth and memory, but as real. Estate, an asset to be liquidated. She saw my Sundays not as a family gathering, but as a chore, a duty to be endured. Her impatience was a slow poison she had been feeding my son for years, and I had been too blind, too trusting to see it. It was her voice I heard in the background of that message, agreeing with him. My mind raced, tumbling through impossible scenarios. Should I sell the house myself and disappear, leaving them with nothing but a note? The thought was childish, a fleeting fantasy of revenge that left a bitter taste in my mouth. Should I call a lawyer? What would I even say? My son doesn't love me anymore? There was no law against that. The problem wasn't legal. It was a matter of the heart, and my heart, though broken, was beginning to beat with a different rhythm, a war drum. I stood there in the dark hallway for what felt like an eternity, the open cedar chest breathing its ancient woody scent around me. The past and the present were at war within me. The mother who would do anything for her son was battling the woman who refused to be discarded. It was a fight for my own dignity, for the very definition of my existence. Was I the sum of my use to others, or was I something more? Arthur would have known what to say. He would have held my hand and said, "Eleanor, you are the strongest person I know. You just forget it sometimes." His memory was a comfort, but also a stark reminder that I was alone in this fight. He was gone. It was up to me. I couldn't rely on anyone else to save me. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. For decades, my identity had been interwoven with others, as a wife, as a mother. Now stripped of those roles by death and by betrayal, I was left with just Eleanor, and I had to decide if Eleanor was worth fighting for. The face of my grandson, Leo, flashed in my mind, his bright, innocent eyes, the way he would hug my legs so tightly when he arrived on Sundays, his face full of pure, uncomplicated joy. What would happen to him in a world where his father could so easily dispose of his own mother? What lesson would he learn from that? That love is conditional? That people become disposable when they are no longer convenient? The thought of my son passing that cold, transactional view of family down to his own child was more than I could bear. That was the turning point. This was no longer just about me. It was about the legacy of love I had built, a legacy Richard was threatening to demolish. I would not let him teach my grandson that a grandmother's love could be measured in dollars and cents, or that a human being's worth expires with age. I had to fight back, not with screams and accusations, but with the quiet strength I had always possessed. The strength that had allowed me to turn simple thread into something that could last a lifetime. My initial resistance, the fog of doubt and fear, began to burn away under the heat of this newfound purpose. I was not a dead weight. I was a grandmother, a keeper of stories, a holder of memories, and the foundation upon which my son had built his entire life. An anchor, he'd called me. He was right, but he had misunderstood its function. An anchor doesn't just hold you down, it holds you steady in a storm. And he was in a storm of his own making, whether he knew it or not. I took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel like it was scraping my lungs. The air still smelled of cedar and old memories, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like fortitude. My hands, which had been trembling, were now steady. The arthritis still ached in my knuckles, but it was a familiar pain, a part of me. It did not define me. I was more than the sum of my ailments and my age. I closed the lid of the cedar chest, the sound a soft, definitive thud in the quiet house. It was the sound of a door closing on one chapter of my life and another beginning. I would not confront him with tears. I would not beg for his affection or remind him of my sacrifices. Pleading was beneath me. I would respond not to the son who had betrayed me, but to the businessman who saw me as an expense. And I would do it on my own terms. I walked back into the kitchen, my steps no longer heavy but deliberate. The little black rectangle of my phone was still on the counter where I'd left it after picking it up off the floor. I looked at it, not as an instrument of my pain, but as a tool, a means to an end. Richard and Susan thought they held all the cards. They had youth, money, and a plan. They thought they were dealing with a frail, sentimental old woman. They had forgotten who I was. I turned on the small lamp above the kitchen sink, casting a warm, focused pool of light on the counter. The rest of the room remained in shadow, but this small circle of light felt like a spotlight on a stage that was now mine. I picked up a pen and a notepad that I kept for grocery lists. The pen felt solid in my hand, much like my silver shears. It was another tool, one I hadn't used for a fight in a very long time. My mind was surprisingly clear. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, calm certainty. I knew that whatever I did next would change our family forever. There would be no going back to the comfortable illusion of Sunday lasagnas and polite smiles. The break was absolute, but I would not be the one who was broken. I would be the one who made the clean cut. I thought about the house, this small bungalow in Asheville that had held my entire life. Richard called it that house, as if it were just an asset on a balance sheet. To me, it was everything. It was the floorboards Arthur and I had polished together, the walls that had absorbed decades of laughter, the windows that framed the mountains I loved. It was my home, and it was mine. That single, simple fact was the key. A plan began to form in my mind, not born of anger, but of a fierce, protective love for myself and for the memory. of the life I had built. It was a quiet plan, a careful plan, one that required the precision of a seamstress, not the brute force of an argument. I would need to be strategic, using the very things they underestimated, my age, my perceived frailty, my quiet nature, to my advantage. I clicked the pen. The sound was sharp, decisive. I looked at the first item on my old grocery list, Leo's favorite cookies. A pang of sadness hit me, but I pushed it aside. This was no time for sentimentality. That part of my life was over. I flipped to a fresh page on the notepad. My hand was steady as I began to write. Not a grocery list, but a list of a different kind. It started with a name. The name of a real estate agent my friend from church had recommended a few years ago. Then, the name of a financial advisor. And finally, the name of a lawyer who specialized in estate planning. I wasn't just planning for my death anymore. I was planning for the rest of my life. A life that would be lived entirely, on my own terms. Richard wanted to live his own life. I was about to grant him his wish. The Wednesday morning after felt different. The list I had written sat on my kitchen table under the soft morning light. The names of strangers looking back at me like a dare. My hand hovered over the phone for a full 10 minutes before I could bring myself to dial the first number. My heart was pounding in my ears. A frantic, frightened drumbeat. I was Eleanor Vance, a seamstress, a grandmother. What business did I have calling a real estate agent? The voice in my head, which sounded distressingly like Richard's, whispered that this was foolish, that I was an old woman playing a game I didn't understand. I almost hung up before anyone even answered. My first conversation with the realtor, a woman named Martha, with a surprisingly gentle voice, was a disaster of nerves. I stumbled over my words, referring to my bungalow as just a little old place, minimizing its worth before she'd even asked. I felt like a child asking for permission to sell my own home. When she asked about my timeline, I panicked and said I was just exploring options, a phrase that felt like a retreat. I hung up the phone feeling smaller than ever, the cold sweat on my brow a testament to my own inadequacy. The first step in my grand plan felt more like a monumental trip and fall. The call to the financial advisor was even more intimidating. A man named Mr. Davies spoke in a language of assets, equities, and trusts that felt entirely foreign. I clutched the receiver, nodding and saying, "I see," when in fact, I saw nothing but a fog of my own ignorance. He was patient, but his patience only highlighted how little I knew about the money Arthur and I had so carefully saved. I felt a hot flush of shame. For decades, my domain had been fabric and thread, not finance. I was an expert in my world, but in Richard's world, the world of numbers and bottom lines, I was a complete novice. That night, the doubt came back with a vengeance. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and the weight of my son's words crushed me all over again. A dead weight, an expense. Maybe he was right. What was I even trying to prove? This house was too big for me anyway. The stairs were getting harder, and the silence was a constant companion. The temptation to tear up that list, to call Richard and apologize for what I didn't even know, was overwhelming. It would be so much easier to just surrender, to let them take over and do what they thought was best. It would be easier to simply fade away. Then on Thursday, Richard called. His voice was casual, normal. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you holding up with all this rain?" The sound of his voice, so untroubled, so oblivious to the wreckage he'd caused, was like a splash of icy water. I had to physically grip the kitchen counter to keep my own voice steady. "I'm fine, dear. Just puttering around the house." The lie felt slick and ugly in my mouth, but it was also a shield. It was the first time I had ever consciously kept a secret from my son, and the act of doing so created a small, hard kernel of strength inside me. That phone call changed something. I realized I couldn't afford to be the timid, uncertain woman who had fumbled through those first calls. I spent the next 2 days at my kitchen table, but not with my sewing. I had my old laptop out, looking up every term Mr. Davies had used. I filled a notebook with definitions and questions. My house was no longer just my sanctuary. It became my headquarters, my war room. The scent of coffee mingled with the smell of old paper as I unearthed decades of bank statements and property deeds, transforming myself from a victim into a researcher. When I met Martha, the realtor, in person the following week, I was a different woman. I had a list of questions written on a crisp sheet of paper. I asked about the local market, closing costs, and her commission rates. I saw the flicker of surprise and respect in her eyes. She had likely expected a confused old widow, but instead, she was meeting with a homeowner who was serious about her business. I was learning to speak their language, the cold, clear language of transactions. It felt unnatural, but also incredibly powerful. My next meeting with Mr. Davies was similar. I brought my notebook, and when he handed me a projection of my financial future based on the sale of the house, I was able to follow along. I pointed to a line item and asked, "Can you explain the tax implications of this particular investment?" He blinked, then smiled, and explained it to me as an equal. For the first time, I didn't feel like a burden or an expense. I felt like a client. I felt like a person with agency over her own life, and the feeling was as intoxicating as the mountain air on a clear day. But the progress wasn't a straight line. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old papers, I found a crayon drawing of two smiling stick figures holding hands. "Grandma and Leo," it said in his wobbly 8-year-old handwriting. The pain that shot through me was so sharp it made me gasp. My fight for dignity felt in that moment like a selfish act that could cost me my grandson. Was I tearing our family apart? The internal battle raged, my love for Leo warring with my newfound need for self-preservation. I had to remind myself that true love couldn't be built on a foundation of disrespect. The most difficult step was walking into the lawyer's office. Ms. Albright was a woman who seemed to be carved from granite, her questions precise and devoid of sentiment. I explained that I needed to set up a living trust and redraft my will. I didn't tell her the story about the audio message. I just stated that I wanted to ensure my final wishes were ironclad and that I had sole control over my assets while I was alive. She listened, nodding slowly, her pen scratching across a legal pad. There was no pity in her eyes, only professionalism, which was exactly what I needed. She sent me home with a mountain of paperwork and a list of decisions I needed to make. Who would be my executor? Who would have medical power of attorney? Each question was a stark reminder of my own mortality and my solitude. For days, I felt overwhelmed, the sheer volume of legal jargon threatening to drown me. But then I remembered my sewing. A wedding dress isn't made in an hour. It's made one stitch at a time. So, I tackled the legal documents the same way. One clause, one decision, one signature at a time. A new habit formed during those weeks. Every afternoon, I started taking a long walk through my neighborhood. At first, my knees ached and my breath was short, but I pushed myself, walking a little farther each day. The walks weren't just for my body, they were for my mind. They forced me out of the house, out of the echo chamber of my own thoughts. I started noticing things again. The color of the hydrangeas in a neighbor's yard, the sound of children playing down the street. I was rejoining the world, one step at a time. The outside world began to notice me too. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, saw Martha's car in my driveway for the second time and asked me over the fence if I was feeling all right. "Just getting my affairs in order. You know how it is at our age," I said, with a calm smile that I didn't feel. The lie was getting easier to tell, but the feeling of being watched, of my private battle becoming public speculation, was deeply unsettling. I knew it was only a matter of time before word got back to Richard. And it did. He called that Friday, his voice tight with a tension he was trying to hide. "Mom, Mrs. Gable mentioned she saw a realtor at your house. Is everything okay? You're not in some kind of trouble, are you?" The condescension in his tone, the immediate assumption that I was a victim or incompetent, stoked the fire in my belly. "Everything is fine, Richard. I'm just being prudent." I kept my voice even, giving him nothing to grab onto. The silence on his end of the line was long and heavy. He was suspicious, and I knew this was the start of a new, colder war. A major setback nearly derailed everything. An old investment bond that Arthur had bought decades ago was missing from my bank's records. I spent 3 days on the phone, being passed from one department to another, each time having to retell my story to a new, indifferent voice. I was just a number, an old woman they hoped would simply give up. The old feelings of helplessness washed over me, and I collapsed into my armchair, weeping with frustration. They were right. I couldn't do this. I was too old, too tired, too alone. But the next morning, I woke up with my jaw set. I would not be dismissed. I put on my best dress, gathered every piece of paper I had, and went to the main branch of the bank in person. I asked to speak to the branch manager and refused to leave until he saw me. I laid out my documents on his polished desk and explained the situation calmly and firmly. It took 2 hours, but he found it. A clerical error from 20 years ago. Walking out of that bank, clutching the proof of my own perseverance, I felt 10 feet tall. The nights remained the hardest. In the quiet darkness, the ghost of the family I thought I had would visit me. I missed the sound of Leo's laughter filling these rooms. I missed the man I thought my son was. Some nights I would allow myself to grieve, to cry for the life and the love that had been an illusion. But I learned to treat my grief like a visitor. I would acknowledge it, sit with it for a while, and then I would show it the door. It was not allowed to live here anymore. The day I signed the final papers for the living trust with Ms. Albright was a milestone. The pen felt incredibly heavy in my hand as I signed my name over and over again. Each signature was a declaration of independence. I, Eleanor Vance, was the sole trustee of my own life. No one could make a decision about my home, my health, or my money without my consent. The legal language was a fortress I had built around myself, brick by boring, complicated brick. Then came an unexpected challenge that felt like a cruel joke. Martha informed me that a home inspector had found a small leak in the roof that needed to be repaired before the house could be listed. It was another expense, another problem I had to solve on my own. A year ago, I would have called Richard, in a panic. Instead, I called 3 different roofing companies. I got 3 written quotes. I compared them, and I even negotiated the price down by $100. I was becoming a person I didn't recognize, and I liked her. The phone call from Susan came out of the blue. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone I knew meant she wanted something. "Eleanor, darling, we were just thinking. We haven't spent enough time with you lately. Why don't we come over for dinner on Saturday instead of Sunday?" This week? It was so transparent it was almost insulting. They knew something was up, and this was a mission to find out what. The old me would have agreed instantly, desperate for their attention. The new me said, calmly and clearly, "That's very sweet, Susan, but this Saturday isn't a good time for me." The stunned silence on the other end was the most satisfying sound I had heard in weeks. Finally, the day came. Martha arrived with a wooden post and a hammer. I watched from my living room window as she pounded the "for sale" sign into my front lawn. The sight of it, so bold and official, sent a jolt of both terror and liberation through me. There was no going back now. My quiet rebellion was no longer a secret. It was a public statement for the entire world, and for my son to see. I stood there watching the sign, and I didn't feel sad. I felt a profound and unfamiliar sense of peace. Packing up the house was not the heartbreaking process I had feared. It was a careful, deliberate act of curation. I sorted through 60 years of memories, boxing up the things that truly mattered and letting go of the rest. Each object I touched told a story, but I was no longer a passive keeper of those stories. I was the editor, deciding which ones to carry into my next chapter. This wasn't an eviction. It was a decluttering of the soul. I was making space for a future I hadn't yet designed. The house sold in 4 days. A young couple from out of state made a cash offer that was significantly above my asking price. When Martha called with the news, I had to sit down. The numbers she quoted felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Later, when Mr. Davies showed me the final figures on paper, it became real. It wasn't a lottery win, not by any means, but it was enough. It was more than enough. It was security. It was independence. It was the key to a door I never even knew existed. I found a small modern 2-bedroom apartment in a building downtown, one with a concierge and a small gym. It was bright and clean, a blank canvas. Most importantly, it had a wide balcony with a perfect view of the morning sun, a place where my geraniums would be very happy. The thought of moving, of starting over at 78, didn't fill me with dread. Instead, it sparked a flicker of excitement. I was about to create a new home, one that was entirely and completely my own. I was sitting on my front porch swing, taking in the view of the mountains one last time, when my phone began to buzz. I looked at the screen. It was Richard. I could feel the panic radiating from his name. He must have just seen the sold banner stretched across the sign on my lawn. I watched the phone vibrate in my hand, his name glowing on the dark screen. The woman who lived in this house a month ago would have answered on the first ring, her heart full of dread and a desperate need to explain herself. But she wasn't here anymore. I took a slow breath of the cool Asheville air, turned the phone over, and let it ring. The buzzing of the phone in my hand was a summons I was finally ready to answer. I let it ring twice more, a small private moment of reclaiming my own time, before I finally pressed the green icon. Richard's voice was a frantic torrent, a stark contrast to the weary resignation I had heard in his message. "Mom, what is going on? I just drove past the house. There's a sold sign on the lawn. Is this some kind of scam? Did someone take advantage of you?" The immediate assumption that I was a victim, a frail old woman incapable of making her own decisions, was the final confirmation that I had done the right thing. It was no longer painful. It was simply clarifying. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the cool mountain air filling my lungs. "Hello, Richard. No, it's not a scam. I sold the house." I said the words as simply as I might announce I had bought a new brand of tea. The silence on the other end of the line was a chasm, a vast empty space, where his understanding was supposed to be. I could practically hear him trying to process a reality that did not fit into the neat, convenient box he had built for me in his mind. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, it had broken the connection. He and Susan were at my door within 20 minutes. Their faces were a study in barely controlled panic. Richard's was pale with a kind of bewildered anger, while Susan's was tight with fury, her eyes darting around the living room, which was now filled with neatly labeled boxes. "You can't be serious, Mom," Richard began, his voice shaking slightly. "You can't just sell the house. This is our family home. We had plans." He stopped himself, but the word hung in the air between us, heavy and damning. "This was my home, Richard," I replied, my voice calm and even. The woman I had been just a few weeks ago would have been trembling, apologizing, trying to smooth over his anger, but that woman was packed away in one of these boxes, a memory of a life I no longer lived. And I decided it was time for me to make new plans for myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet finality of my words was more powerful than any shout could ever be. I was not asking for his permission. I was informing him of a decision. Susan, unable to contain her frustration, finally spoke. "But what about us, Eleanor? What about Leo? We were going to help you. We were going to make sure you were taken care of." The word help sounded like an accusation, the phrase taken care of a threat. She looked at the stacked boxes as if I had personally stolen something from her. She wasn't seeing a mother-in-law reclaiming her life. She was seeing an asset that had just been liquidated without her consent, and the anger in her eyes was purely transactional. I looked from her face to my son's. He looked lost, as if the ground had vanished from beneath his feet. He had always seen me as a constant, a fixed point in his universe that he could rely on, or more recently, manage. The idea that I was my own celestial body, with my own orbit and my own trajectory, was something he simply could not comprehend. He had forgotten that before I was his mother, I was Eleanor Vance, a person with her own thoughts, her own dreams, and now, her own future. "I appreciate the thought," I said, the polite phrase a thin veil over the cold truth. "But I've come to realize that I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself. In fact, it seems I've been an anchor holding you down for far too long." I used his exact word, letting it drop into the space between us. I watched for the impact. Richard flinched as if I had physically struck him. His eyes widened with the sickening, dawning horror of a man who has just been caught. He knew. In that instant, he knew that I had heard everything. His face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, guilt, a flicker of shame, and then, settling on a petulant anger. It was the anger of being exposed. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain. He doubled down. "This is ridiculous," he stammered, looking for a foothold in an argument he had already lost. "You're being selfish. You haven't thought this through." But I had thought of nothing else. For weeks, I had done nothing but think it through, one painful, liberating step at a time. I simply shook my head, a small, sad smile on my lips. "On the contrary, Richard, for the first time in a very long time, have thought everything through. I gestured to the boxes, to the shell of the life I was leaving behind. I'm moving into a lovely apartment downtown. It has a balcony for my geraniums and a concierge. I won't need to worry about the roof or the stairs. It's practical. It's an expense I can manage. It's a decision that benefits my own life. Each word was a deliberate echo of his own cold logic, repurposed for my own declaration of independence. They left without another word. The slam of the front door was the final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life I was now closing for good. I stood alone in the echo of their departure, the scent of Susan's sharp perfume still hanging in the air. I did not feel victorious. I felt a profound and heavy sadness, a grief for the son I thought I had, for the family I had so lovingly imagined. But beneath the grief, there was a solid foundation of peace. I had not been destroyed. I had endured. Moving day was a blur of motion and finality. As the movers carried my armchair out the door, the last piece of the old life to go, I ran my hand over the worn fabric one last time. It was not a sad farewell. It was a release. Walking through the empty rooms of the bungalow, rooms that had held 60 years of my life, I felt not loss, but lightness. The walls were no longer holding memories. They were just walls. My memories were inside me, and they were coming with me. My new apartment was a blank canvas, filled with the scent of fresh paint and the promise of a new beginning. The first thing I did, before unpacking a single box, was to place my geraniums on the wide, sunny balcony. As I looked out over the city of Asheville, a view I had only ever seen from a distance, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't realized was missing. This was my view now. This was my home, and I had chosen it. The woman who moved into that apartment was not the same one who had collapsed in shock just a month earlier. The old Eleanor's world was her small bungalow, her quiet routines, her Sunday dinners. The new Eleanor joined the building's book club. She took a water aerobics class at the community gym. She learned the names of the baristas at the coffee shop downstairs. She was no longer waiting for life to come to her on Sundays. She was walking out to meet it every single day. Of course, there was pain. Richard, in a final cruel attempt to control me, refused to bring Leo to visit. "You've confused him, Mom. He doesn't understand why you left your home," he'd said on the phone, his voice dripping with blame. The ache of missing my grandson was a physical wound, but I refused to be manipulated by it. I sent Leo letters filled with stories and photos of my new life. I would not let my son poison that pure, beautiful love. I would keep that connection alive on my own terms. One afternoon, a package arrived. Inside was a crayon drawing. It showed a tall, modern building with a little stick figure on a balcony, watering bright red. Flowers. Next to her was another, smaller stick figure, waving. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, it said, "Grandma and me in your new castle." I pressed the drawing to my chest, and the tears that came were not tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of hope. I had not destroyed my family. I had simply redefined it. My life now is smaller in square footage, but infinitely larger in every other way. I have friends. I have interests. I have a view of the mountains that still takes my breath. Away every morning. I am no longer just a mother or a widow. I am Eleanor. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the steady, patient work of a seamstress, stitching together a new pattern for her life. One day, one choice, one brave step at a time. The old me measured my worth by how much I was needed. I spent my life being the sturdy, reliable fabric for everyone else's creations. When I heard my son's words, I thought the fabric had been torn beyond repair, but I was wrong. I learned that my worth was not in the thread. It was in the hands that knew how to sew. It was in the strength to pick up the needle and start again, not to mend what was broken, but to create something entirely new. The reflection that looks back at me from the balcony's glass doors is different now. The lines on my face are the same. The hair is still silver, but my eyes are clear. They are not the eyes of a dead weight, waiting to be discarded. They are the eyes of a woman who owns her own story. They are the eyes of a woman who knows that her value is not dependent on her usefulness to anyone else. It is inherent. It is absolute. I've learned that the heaviest anchors in our lives are often the roles we allow others to assign to us. For years, I was the mother, a role I cherished, but one that eventually consumed my entire identity. It took the most painful moment of my life to realize that the role had ended, but the person, Eleanor, had not. I had to find her again. Buried under decades of lasagna dinners and selfless love, the world sees old age as a season of fading, of becoming less. But for me, it has become a season of discovery. I shed a life that was no longer mine, and found a strength I never knew I possessed. It was a terrifying journey, one I took alone, but it led me back to the one person I had neglected for far too long, myself, and I found that she was far more resilient than I ever could have imagined. My son and I do not speak. Perhaps one day he will understand, but I am not waiting for his validation. My peace no longer depends on it. I live my life for myself now, for the joy of a sunny morning on my balcony, for the camaraderie of my book club, for the sweet, simple hope contained in a child's drawing. It is a quiet life, but it is a powerful one. It is a life that is entirely, unapologetically mine. The greatest conquest was not selling the house or achieving financial independence. It was the moment I realized that my son's words, which had shattered my world, were ultimately just that, words. They were his opinion, his judgment, born of his own weakness. They were not my truth. My truth is that I am not an expense on someone else's balance sheet. I am the entire ledger. This journey has taught me that dignity is not something that is given to you. It is something you claim. It can be terrifying to stand up and declare your own worth, especially when the people you love are the ones telling you that you have none. But the alternative, to quietly accept erasure, to fade into the background of your own life, is a fate far worse than any confrontation. I often think about that ticking clock in my old kitchen, the one that sounded so cruel on that terrible afternoon. It was marking the seconds of a life I thought was ending, but I see now that it wasn't counting down. It was counting up. It was counting towards the moment I would finally choose to live. It was the sound of my own quiet, relentless, and beautiful revolution beginning. So, if you ever feel like you are being defined by someone else's narrative, if you feel like your chapter is being written for you, I want you to remember this. You hold the pen. It doesn't matter if your hand is trembling. It doesn't matter if you're 78 or 28. You have the power to turn the page and start a new chapter, one stitch at a time. Your story is not over until you decide it is. My name is Eleanor Vance. I was a seamstress. I was a wife. I was a mother. Now, I am simply and finally myself, and it is more than enough. It is everything. I am living proof that it is never, ever too late to stop being an anchor and start being the captain of your own ship, sailing toward a horizon of your own choosing. The view, I can promise you, is magnificent.